May the words of my mouth and the meditations of all our hearts be acceptable in your sight, O God, our Creator, our Redeemer, and the one who sustains us. Amen.
Amen.
Please be seated. Well, welcome to the Easter season. You've probably noticed a big shift in the way we do liturgy between the season of Lent and the season of Easter. And the season of Easter goes from the first Sunday of Easter for 50 days until Pentecost. And you've probably noticed that we say and sing Alleluia a lot, which is wonderful. Reverend Roshni and our music director Sam can finally choose happier hymns to sing during the liturgy. We've put the Gloria back into the services. And you will notice that for the next couple weeks, we hear in the Gospels some of the stories of the resurrection appearances of Jesus to his disciples. The other thing that changes during the Easter season is that the lectionary assigns as our first lesson a reading from the book of Acts rather than from the Old Testament. And though it would be rather tempting today to talk about Thomas the Twin, that's his real nickname, by the way, Thomas the Twin, and I sometimes call him the patron saint of kinesthetic learning. The teachers here will get that. I can see them smiling. But it would be good to talk about how his doubt led to great faith. But I feel like Thomas gets a lot of attention both in the commentaries and in preaching. And this morning, I want to focus a little bit more on the lectionary reading that gets overlooked, and that's the one from Acts. And in it, Luke describes a picture of the early church as a place where everyone sold what they had and pooled their resources and shared with one another so that no one was in need. And today's reading, which came from chapter 4, is actually the second time that Luke describes the early church this way. He also describes it this way in chapter 2, verses 44 to 47. And in part, he says, "All who believed were together and had all things in common. They would sell their possessions and goods and distribute the proceeds to all as any had need." When I went to the internet and consulted a number of biblical commentators on this particular passage, it seemed like a lot of them were unwilling to take this passage at face value as an accurate depiction of the early church. And it appeared to me that some of their reluctance was because they thought that the way Luke was describing the early church sounded a little too much like socialism or communism. But those two economic political systems, at least the way we understand them today, didn't exist in the first century CE in Roman-occupied territories. So I don't think that we are in any danger of making a direct line between Acts of the Apostles and communism as it is today. And I think part of the reluctance to take this at face value is that we live in a very different economic system. And so those of us in North America who live in this very different system might have a bit of blindness to the fact that other cultures have had and continue to have different ways of looking at possessions and distributing wealth. And so there's a bit of blindness to that and a reluctance because we assume that what is normal for us is normal for everyone. And we might even have a bit of a bias towards it for no other reason than familiarity. It's hard for us to conceive of any other kind of system working. I think we forget sometimes that Christian religious communities of nuns and monks actually live this way today, that they sell all their possessions when they enter the monastery or the convent, and they share all their goods together. They have everything in common. I also think that some of the reluctance to take this description of the early church at face value is a fear that in examining too closely the systems that we do live in, we might have to change. Because if we find those systems wanting, parts of those systems wanting and not matching up with our Christian values, we might have to change. And change is scary. I am at an age now where I am helping the older generations in my family to downsize. And as I do that, I start thinking maybe I should be doing this myself so that I'm not leaving a whole bunch of stuff to deal with later in my life or leaving it for my kids to deal with later on. And I'm finding it really hard. Hard helping that older generation to downsize, hard thinking about downsizing myself, because every object that we touch has a memory attached to it. It's connected often to someone that we love. Or sometimes it's because we think, oh, that might be good for something someday, so we're going to put it aside. And so it makes it difficult to change and to look at our possessions differently. And so when we hear these passages from Acts, we're tempted to just dismiss them as too idealistic or not something you could do in the real world. And I think that would be a shame, because these passages and others throughout the Bible teach us a really important lesson. And that's that we live an embodied faith that demands that we act in ways that are consistent with belief. Throughout the New Testament, there is an understanding that all are equal in the sight of God. And that spiritual understanding then translates into a belief that all should be equal and have enough in this physical life too. The purpose of the early Christians selling all of their goods and holding all things in common, sharing among the members of the community, was a way to make sure that no one was in need and to enact in their lives a belief that all were equal. So I think we should consider that this portrait of the early Christian church is the structure that they were trying to live up to and not some fictional narrative that we can easily dismiss. And it encourages us to look at alternate ways of viewing wealth and possessions. And even if it is an idealized portrait of the early church, it's an ideal worth striving for. That idea of mutual care, mutual reciprocity, of loving one another as Jesus commanded, the way in which Jesus loved us. We saw on Maundy Thursday that love of others often looks like acts of humble service, of giving of oneself so that others can have what they need as well. Amen.